Welcome to the Ideas Hour with your hosts David Cameron and Suzanne Zeedyk, exploring big ideas that matter. This series was originally broadcast on Teacher Hug Radio in 2021 and 2022. It is still available in their archive as well as in this format.
Today, we're going to explore the origins of authoritarianism. We're seeing it on the rise all over the world. In Brazil, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Cambodia. We've seen it clearly in the USA with Donald Trump, where we've seen a president deny democracy and demand violent action to overturn an electoral decision. We've seen it here in the UK with the current government, led by Boris Johnson and Priti Patel as Home Secretary. We have a government that has attacked the press, particularly the BBC, attacked the power of the judiciary, and attempted to restrict the right to protest. If, like us, you're concerned about this, it's vital that we gain a better understanding of what drives support for these authoritarian leaders, who are, by and large, democratically elected.
And we could not have a better guest to help us in thinking about the origins of authoritarianism than today's guest, Professor Stanley Feldman, who comes to us from Stony Brook University in New York in the USA. He spent his entire career as a political scientist trying to understand political preferences, including the structure of political values, the psychological bases of attitudes, and the origins of political ideologies. And what's one of his most seminal findings? That political preferences are related to ideas about behavior, especially in children. And if that sounds surprising, well, he's accumulated robust data sets that demonstrate and unpack that link. And we think that everyone deserves, in fact, needs to know of his work. So, Stanley Feldman, welcome to the Ideas Hour.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me on.
Can we kick off? Could you tell folks a bit about your motivations that lead you to be interested in political attitudes, especially authoritarianism? Why do you want to study that?
I've always been interested in why people come to politics with such different perspectives on the world, with such different attitudes, with such different values. We see this all the time. So most obviously, the conflict between people on the political left and the political right. Why some people think that we, need more egalitarianism, need more government action, and other people think that an increasing government role just hurts society and harms people. On authoritarianism, we think about diverse reactions to immigration. Some people feel threatened by immigration. They feel that mass immigration is harmful to their countries, culturally, economically. Other people welcome immigration. They feel that it's wealthy countries' responsibility to welcome needy migrants, and in fact, they value diversity in their society. And so it's those widely divergent points of view that really form the basis for politics that I've always been interested in.
And this is brilliant for us, Stanley, because one of the reasons for doing the program is that we've been concerned about the terrible dichotomy there is in opinion and the conflict that's generated between dichotomies. And we feel there's been an absence of public debate and discourse, and that's been replaced by a kind of loud hailer democracy, if you like, of people shouting at one another. And you've highlighted and encapsulated a whole number of the issues and reasons for that. But maybe just to make that focus even sharper, right now at this point in the 21st century, why do you think your insights and the insights provided by your data matter so much?
I think, politics has always been about resolving different preferences and different values. What we are increasingly seeing around the world is just an intensification of political conflict in societies. Parties have staked out more and more divergent positions. People have become more and more polarized, more and more concerned about where their country is going. There's a feeling on both sides of the political spectrum that, if the opposition party takes over, that it will have disastrous effects for the country. So what we're really seeing is not something new, but just an intensification of conflicts that have been around for a long time, but that are now really engaging people in a very deep-seated way. And I think as well, political parties are working to exacerbate those conflicts for political ends. So I don't think there's any question, as we look around the world, the degree of political polarization in many countries has increased. People's feelings about politics have gotten more intense, and political parties have moved farther in some cases on the extremes to take advantage of that political polarization. So I think there's these are not things that we see just in the US or just in the UK, but we see in many places around the world right now.
I think you said something really profound and interesting in that. You talked about politics and you talked about resolution. You talked about opposing views and the quest for resolution. And I think arguably that's what we've lost in the current debate, that it's a quest for victory rather than resolution. And I think that really sits well alongside the other comments you've made. But in terms of, I suppose, addressing that, many of our listeners are teachers. Practically all of them will be teachers or people involved in the education sector in some way. And they have a key role to play, I think, around all of this. So maybe just to amplify what you've said in terms of your insights and how they matter to that audience of teachers and educationalists.
So I'll come back to now to specifically the issue of authoritarianism, and so one thing that we know is that we can reliably detect differences in authoritarianism by the time people get to university. So we've had decades of studies documenting reliable, stable differences in authoritarianism and in authoritarian predispositions in students entering university, which suggests that whatever the origins of authoritarianism and other political beliefs are, that there's a lot that we need to understand about childhood, about the education process, that I think it helped people to be aware that we don't just get political beliefs somehow when we turn 18, that somehow all of a sudden we develop this understanding of politics. There's an accumulation of experiences, of learning that goes on from the time children become aware of the world around them. And so understanding that the beginnings of political values, of understandings of politics occur quite early and are oftentimes in place by the time people graduate from high school, I think is really important for people to understand that there are important factors, there are developmental processes that we need to understand better and that we need to be aware of.
Let's go back for a second. You just used the phrase authoritarian predispositions and authoritarianism. Can you tell people what you mean by that?
Let me start by saying that that psychologists have been studying authoritarianism since the 1940s. And so to understand why we talk about this trait as authoritarianism, I think it's important to understand the history that this really emerged out of Nazi Germany, support for the Nazi Party, the Holocaust, and the like. So I think people sometimes, because of the terminology, don't quite understand what the contemporary meaning of authoritarianism is. So I think, in my mind, and what colleagues of mine also have developed, authoritarianism is a reflection of how people think about the world around them and how we live together as a society. And so, we have a choice as societies on whether or not we are going to allow people a maximum amount of freedom to pursue their interests, to develop their talents, to explore the world, or if we're going to have a society where people conform to societal norms that keep disorder at a minimum, that minimize the chance for conflict in society. I think people may not articulate this conflict, but it is a conflict. You can't simultaneously allow people to explore the world and to act on their preferences and to think about how to maximize their freedom to be the sort of person they want to be, and at the same time to say that what we need to do is have a society where people obey the rules, where people understand the proper way of behaving, because that is a way of keeping society together and preventing us from becoming, just chaotic. So I think what modern social science thinks of authoritarianism is this sort of desire for social conformity. It's a desire for order in society and maintaining order in society. And that's not necessarily a terrible thing, although it can, under certain circumstances, result in some undesirable political outcomes.
So I hear you saying that authoritarianism, through your eyes, is how you keep in balance the need for order in society in contrast with individual freedoms. And the balance that you have between those and the tensions that you feel or the ease that you feel is at the heart of authoritarianism, and how anxious you feel about will there be too much disorder. Have I got that right?
Yes, exactly. The authoritarianism is a continuum, right? People vary, and the fact is what study after study after study show is that most people try to balance these two tendencies, right? They want a certain amount of freedom in society, but on the other hand, not so much freedom that there is incredible amounts of disorder. So most people try to balance this. But for some people, one of these values just totally dominates the other. And it's when the desire for social conformity, for order in society, fear of disorder, really dominates people's desire for freedom, that we start to see authoritarianism.
And that's in place by the time you're starting university, college.
To a great extent, yes. I wouldn't say that it is completely stable for the rest of your life, but yes, there's no question that we can detect these differences by the time people start universities. And we haven't really done the detailed research to see how early we can detect these differences, but I think well before then as well.
Amazing. David?
I'm really interested, Stanley, in the idea of intolerance and authoritarianism. It seems to me that there are a number of people who would be very authoritarian around issues like drugs, around issues like crime. That there would be a strong authoritarian thrust around the protection of property, the preservation of rights. And at some point, that clearly bleeds into intolerance and discrimination. So what's the relationship in your mind and from your research between these two aspects of intolerance, if you like, discriminatory behavior, and authoritarianism purely and simply in terms of the dominance of the state?
It's important to recognize that political attitudes are always a result of a combination of a person's sort of temperament, predispositions on the one hand, and the environment that they find themselves in on the other hand. It's never one or the other. And so, what's important to understand about the political consequences of authoritarianism, and particularly, as you suggest, when it becomes intolerance, is the extent to which people who have this desire for social conformity, for order in society, start to get really threatened. When they start to look around and think, I don't understand what's happening. There's too much change going on. The desire for order in society is really threatened by social change, right? People come into the country, they look different. All of a sudden, homosexuality is now out in the open. There's gay marriage. Women are taking on leadership positions. All of these things are indicators that the world is changing. And for people high in authoritarianism, that's really threatening, right? And so when they get threatened, what happens? What happens is that they look to political leaders to try to reestablish that order that they feel is being threatened by social change. And it's very easy to go from there to saying, I don't want to hear about people who are advocating for gay rights. I don't want to hear about people who are advocating for immigration. I don't want to hear about people who are advocating for issues of gender discrimination, right? So because that's a gut level response to feeling threatened, right? And I think that's the important thing for people to understand. Is that the response that we're seeing is really people dealing with a world that is deeply threatening to them, that's uncomfortable for them to live in. And it is a gut level response to saying, this is just wrong. This is uncomfortable. And, we need to take strong action to reverse this, and it comes out as intolerance of alternative points of view.
I think, interestingly, and we will go back to this in terms of the educational aspect, but the other side of that picture that you painted there is the way that authoritarian leaders, through what we talk about now as culture wars, create that sense of threat through othering. So whether or not there was a real problem with immigration, I mean, classically in this country, the scale of the perceived problem with refugees is tiny compared to the sense that people have of that threat. And that's partly fed and created by the leaders. So there's that interaction, isn't there, between othering from the top, if you like, and that sense of insecurity that's coming up from the population more generally.
That's a really important point. I don't want to deny that there's no reality to people's sense of that the world is changing around them. Things are changing, but yes, a lot of this is a reflection of political leaders who have a choice to either, say, don't worry, this is not a threat, immigrants assimilate, we can manage change in a way that is not disruptive of society, or alternatively, leaders who want to capitalize, who understand that some people can be mobilized by making these threats more salient, by making them more insecure. And so, yes, they take a minor news story and make it seem like this is a huge societal problem. They exaggerate changes that we see that in the U.S. People who tune into Fox News in the evenings consistently hear these stories about how immigration is undermining American culture, and how liberals are attacking men and masculinity. And so if you're a viewer listening to these representations constantly, you're just led to believe that there are all of these terrible things happening in society because most people don't experience them directly. And so what we hear about this is from people in the media, from political leaders who have an enormous ability to either manage social change or to make people feel really scared about it.
So Stanley, in my language as a developmental psychologist, I think we're now in the realm of attachment, right? So as soon as we're talking about a sense of threat and a sense of safety, a sense of scariness and a sense of comfort, we're talking attachment. And that sense of threat is wired into your biology. And that you might not, you can carry certain levels of threat until it gets too much, until there's too much change. And then I think the authoritarianism, the intolerance starts to emerge because I've now reached this threshold that I've stepped over. So that's one of the reasons that I think your work is so exciting, is that you are tapping into that sense of threat and trying to make sense of it through a political lens. Can I ask if you ever use the language of attachment in your work or not?
I haven't directly. Colleagues of mine actually have done some exploration of the relationship between insecure attachments and authoritarianism, and there is a relationship there. But that really is an unexplored area of the development of authoritarianism and political attitudes in general. I have to say that political psychologists have not done enough work on socialization that is required to really understand these developmental processes. I think that's one of the major holes in our understanding of this. Is we know how important secure and insecure attachments are as children are developing, and the lingering effects of that in adulthood. We also know that there are forces in childhood, factors that are leading to development of authoritarianism, making people more insecure about the world around them. And at some point, we need to connect the threads a lot better. But these are important questions. There's one of the things that we know for certain is that people high in authoritarianism see the world as a threatening place. It's dangerous, it's scary, and they're afraid. There's a lot of fear there.
So Stanley, one of the things that you have helped with political psychology, one of your key findings has been the measurement of authoritarian dispositions. And so when I talk about your work, people are often a bit surprised to find that you measure authoritarian dispositions with 4 key simple questions. You ask people to choose between 2 options, which are basically, do you think children should show independence or respect for elders? Do you think that we should raise them to be considerate or well-behaved? Should they be obedient or self-reliant? Do we want them to be curious or to have good manners? And your research shows that if you force people to make a choice between those 2 things, you can almost come up with a score that shows a relationship as you tip toward authoritarianism. Is that right? Because if it is, people are a bit shocked to discover it can be that easy to start to measure this really deep thing. Am I right? Have I described that well?
Yes, exactly. People are surprised about the measure, but if you think about it, what the measure does is it very nicely taps into this distinction that I was talking about earlier between these 2 different visions of what sort of world you want to live in. Do you want to live in a world where people have a lot of freedom, where they're independent, where they can explore the world in new ways? Or do you want to live in a world where people basically conform to societal standards? And so what those 4 pairs of values do is force people to think about that contrast in a nice, simple way. What's important to understand is it's not really asking about how you raise your children, although it may involve that. It's not necessarily asking about how you were raised, although it may tap into that, but it's basically asking about your values. And my argument has been that if you want people to be obedient, to conform, to follow leaders, to conform to social norms, then that's the way you think children should be raised. And so that those contrast in values are just a very effective way of forcing people to think about where they stand in terms of this sort of freedom conformity trade-off.
And suddenly you're talking about teachers as well as parents, as well as strangers walking down the street, talking about how children behave. It taps into this wider sense of children and therefore people are meant to behave. David, you want to come in?
So, yeah, it's really fascinating to me because I would argue that you only have societal standards in what is already an authoritarian society. That in a non-authoritarian society, what you have is pluralism. You have different standards and different values. And this is really intriguing in terms of Britain because the government, the UK government, has argued for the promotion of British values, despite the fact that they've got no apparent attachment to them in the way they conduct themselves. But they want that highlighted. And they also are pushing very strongly in the United Kingdom, in England in particular, for a curriculum that's about delivering the best that we know, the best that's been thought, the best that's been done, a curriculum that focuses on the best of our traditions, the best of our values, and majors on the great men, rarely, interestingly, on the great women who might get squeezed in with a vague mention at some point, and our great achievements. And it seems to me that this is almost designed to reinforce authoritarianism. Would you agree with that?
It's a little hard to say whether or not it actually reinforces authoritarianism, as opposed to what it's trying to do is to minimize the threats to authoritarianism. So, if you are concerned about maintaining, commitment to traditional norms, which is usually a major focus of authoritarian leaders, then, what's really threatening is people advancing new ideas, challenging ideas that challenge traditional norms, that point out the harms done by traditions in society that have excluded groups from full participation in society, that have excluded women from full participation in society. It's those ideas that are threatening. It's not clear to me that the consequences of that, those actions, make people more authoritarian. What they do is to try to minimize the challenges to authoritarianism. Some of that, I think, is, I don't want this to come out the wrong way, but in a way symbolic. They're trying to make a case to their audience that we're the ones who are defending your values, right? We're the ones who are standing up to people who are saying that British traditions are discriminatory and have hurt people and are no longer the values that that we need to take into the 21st century. And so, a lot of this, with a very similar thing in the US, all of a sudden, a manufactured debate over what's called critical race theory, which is not anything that has been a major element in the educational system. But by making it an issue, you send a clear signal to people that, one, this is a threat. It's a threat to our collective values. And secondly, our party, are going to defend society from this threat. So I think that the signaling is really important here. And sometimes the signaling is more important than actually what happens on the ground.
Attachment sense of threat is unconscious to most people. You can have this impact as a divisive leader by creating a sense of safety without the voters even quite realizing that that's what's happening for them. And it raises questions about how consciously are the leaders doing that. So is this manipulative and malevolent, or is it kind of unconscious on their part too, that they just know it works and they're rolling with it? Stanley, what do you think?
I think it's conscious. I think, there's always some experimentation in politics. Politicians try different things to see what works. This has been going on forever. Politicians hire consultants who do focus groups, and the purpose of the focus groups is to just set out ideas and see how people respond to them. And so there's all of this testing. So it's not necessarily that politicians are these incredibly sharp people who figure this out. Sometimes they stumble on it, but I think when they do come to this understanding, they realize that it's something that they can use, and it's something that they can use to scare people. It's something that they can use. In particular, what politicians are trying to do as much as anything is to say, you need to vote for us because the other party is a threat. The other party is going to put into place policies that are going to harm society, that are going to infringe on your values, that are going to demean your position in society. And so a lot of what politicians do in terms of advocating policies that they want to pursue, is also signaling that we're protecting you from the other people who are the real threat.
So, Stanley, I'm keeping my eye on the time. And as we start to come to the end of this conversation, I find myself wanting to ask, what do you advise then that people do? Right? I want people to come away from this conversation understanding some of these processes better and feeling energized rather than scared. So here's one thing I might come up with. I'm going to guess that you would say, talk about your vision for what you would like your country to be. What are the values you would like to see it represent? Because then we can have this higher level conversation about who are we? Am I right? And what else would you advocate that we might do once we understand this stuff?
So I think, yes, one thing that people need to do is to think about articulating what are their good values for society and why those are positive values, why those will help people, and why society will be better off under a somewhat different set of values than have been traditional ones. So I think that's important. I think the other thing that's really important is that it may not be that easy to eliminate authoritarian predispositions. But I think, again, I want to come back to this point that authoritarian predispositions get activated by a sense of threat, by a sense that we're living in a dangerous world. And I think that's something that can be dealt with. I think what's really important is to somehow reassure young people that people who look different from them, have a different religion from them, have different sexual preferences or orientations from them, are not dangerous, they're not strange, they're not threatening. And that is something that can be done, because if you can reduce the sense of threat, if you can reduce the sense that people are somehow going to create a disorderly world or a dangerous world, you really reduce a lot of the consequences of authoritarianism. Because if people start to feel comfortable with diversity, right, then this reaction that we're seeing, demanding that leaders take action to suppress new ideas, to roll back the social change, is really going to be reduced. So I think that's really a key, particularly for young people. You can see some of this. Younger people, certainly in the US, which is becoming a much more diverse society, who are going to school with people from who are first, second generation immigrants, are, they're growing up in an environment where these are their friends, they're hanging out with them, they're listening to the same music, they don't seem to be scary people, they're less challenged by social change. We see the same thing, a lot of young people who are exploring different gender roles and gender identities, and growing up in that environment. And so in my mind, the most important step that people can take, because, as I say, changing people's underlying sensitivity to threat, changing their core values is hard, but alleviating the sense that people who are different from them are threatening, that they're dangerous, that you don't understand them, that's actually something that we can change, and something that I think would go a long way to slowly but surely increasing people's degree of comfort in a world that is clearly changing around them.
First, a compliment. One of the things that I really want to thank you for is that, completely unbeknown to you, you've touched on a whole range of themes and issues that we've covered over this series. So lots of the issues that came up in a program we did about boarding schools and the impact that has through a number of the questions, if you like, the answers to the questions that you asked. Some of the issues we've had around discussions about feminism and the roots of terrorism, all of that, you've made connections across the board, Stanley, and we're very, very grateful to you for doing that. One of the things I'm really, again, interested in is your last set of comments, though, because effectively what you did was you talked about the value of tolerance. You talked about tolerance as a value. And in a sense, what you said was that value is central to the kind of society that you probably want to live in. And there was a huge period in education where we looked at values education. And the values were based worldwide. There was international research behind them. Tolerance was one, respect was another. And in a sense, what we've had the nationalization of values, because at the heart of nationalism is selfishness. And it's that value of selfishness that allows authoritarianism to rise, whereas tolerance addresses that, as does curiosity. Are you optimistic that these qualities, these values, might triumph? You've indicated your belief in youth. Is there hope?
I look at the young students that I teach. I look at studies of political socialization and reports about, political culture among young people, and I think there is reason for optimism. Kids are growing up now in a sort of very multicultural world, very interconnected world. I think in many countries, even if diversity is threatening to parents and older people, their children are going to schools that are increasingly diverse. And I think that's all positive. I think what we know about positive intergroup contact is that it can be very beneficial in overcoming negative stereotypes, of overcoming threat. And so I think that's all promising. I mean, I have to say, the problem is those sorts of changes are very slow. If you're really counting on new generations to come in with more tolerant values, with a higher level of comfort with diversity, with social change over the long term, that's going to be beneficial, but it's a very slow process. And the question is, where does that leave us now?
So let me wind up then, Stanley, with the last question that we ask all of our guests. What practically would you recommend that teachers and other members of the education system do with this information? So if we leave them on a practical sense, what do you want them to do in those classrooms and corridors which promotes tolerance?
It's not an easy thing to say, okay, what do I do today? It's more of just, how do you create an environment that exposes young people to diversity and social change in a way that's non-threatening? I think that's really important to think about. It's not just a matter of doing something on a particular day as much as thinking about how to convey this sense that people of different religion are not threatening to you, that people who come from different ethnic, racial backgrounds are not really different from us. We're all humans. That there's nothing wrong with exploring non-traditional gender roles. But this all has to be done in a very general way of how do you create the environment. You can't just simply tell people this is the way to think, right? What you have to do is set up an environment that lets young people develop these positive experiences. It's not a lot of times people on the political right think that leftist professors are destroying youth because we're convincing them to be socialists and Marxists. And if you've taught for any length of time, you realize that you can't do that. It's not effective. What's really effective is not the sort of direct lecturing. What's effective is the environment, and creating that environment, and that's what we need to think about.
That's hugely relieving, Stanley, because what I think you're doing is reinforcing for people who are already trying to create that environment of acceptance and tolerance and diversity, that they are doing the key thing you think they should be doing. I think that's hugely positive and reinforcing.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I think so much of the discussion in education is around that idea of atmosphere, environment, relationships versus content. And I think what you've said is content matters, but the way that it's delivered, and you're also tying back into that, they'll forget what you said, but they won't forget how you made them feel. And I think that's a really valuable message to leave with our particular audience of listeners. And thanks to them for being with us and sharing what's been a brilliant experience today.
Thanks for having me.
If you would like to know more about Professor Stanley Feldman's work, you can find a list of his publications on the Stony Brook University website. One of my favorite recent ones is his contribution to an edited collection entitled At the Forefront of Political Psychology, which was published in 2020 by Routledge. His chapter explores how people express intolerance toward groups that threaten their values and, fascinatingly, how political intolerance gave support to Donald Trump in the US election of 2016. We think the insights offered by Stanley Feldman and his colleagues are really valuable in our era of societal division. And we hope that this discussion will have heightened your curiosity and your confidence in the value of introducing children reassuringly to all sorts of diversity within your classroom and community.
This has been the Ideas Hour, brought to you by Suzanne Zeedyk and the real David Cameron.